After the conclusion of the first major campaigns in Gaul, between 58 and 56 BC, the balance that Julius Caesar had laboriously built remained unstable and fragile. The submission of the Helvetii and the victory over the Belgians, which he himself recounts in the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, had given the impression that the whole of Gaul was now tamed, but in reality it was an apparent peace, supported more by Roman military strength than by a real adhesion of the tribes to the dominion of Rome. The Gallic peoples, each linked to their own traditions, their own leaders and their own tribal dynamics, had neither a unitary vision nor a coherent policy, yet the foreign occupation was beginning to produce friction and resentment that would soon explode into local revolts. Caesar, in his story, often underlines the rapidity with which the Gallic populations could move from submission to rebellion, driven by opportunity or by the ambition of a charismatic leader. It is in this context that the figure of Ambiorix, king of the Eburones, one of the Belgian peoples settled between the lower course of the Meuse and the Ardennes, is placed. Until then little known on the Gallic political scene, the Eburones would acquire lasting fame thanks to the rebellion that made them protagonists against Rome. The insurrection, which broke out in 54 BC, was not an isolated episode, but was part of a series of disorders that seriously threatened Caesar's authority in northern Gaul. To understand the significance of these events, it is useful to remember how the Roman organization of the countryside worked. During the Gallic Wars, Caesar divided his legions into various winter camps, located among the recently subjugated populations. The objective was twofold: to guarantee the supply of troops through local requisitions and, at the same time, to maintain constant pressure on the people of the region, preventing them from gathering or preparing uprisings. This system, although logical from a strategic point of view, however made the Roman contingents vulnerable, because the scattered legions could find themselves isolated and without rapid support in the event of a rebellion. The Commentarii de Bello Gallico constitute the main contemporary source for reconstructing these events. In them Caesar not only narrates the facts, but also uses them as a political tool. His account is at the same time a war chronicle and propaganda intended for Rome, where public opinion and the Senate evaluated his action. It is therefore necessary to read with caution the way in which he presents the enemies, often accused of betrayal or deceit, and the way in which he exalts the courage of the legions and his own promptness of command. However, thanks to this direct source, we can follow almost day by day the sequence of events that led from the Roman defeat to Caesar's recovery. In 54 BC, immediately after his second voyage to Britain, Caesar had to deal with the consequences of a serious famine that had struck Gaul. The food requisitions became heavier, and this exacerbated the discontent of the local populations. Caesar distributed the legions into different winter quarters, a decision that the Gauls interpreted as a sign of weakness. It is in this context that Ambiorix and his allies decided to rebel. The Eburones revolt was not a simple episodic reaction, but a coordinated movement that brought into play ingenuity, diplomatic astuteness, and knowledge of the terrain. Ancient authors beside Caesar, such as Cassius Dio and, later, Frontinus in the Stratagemata, recall the cunning with which Ambiorix managed to deceive the Roman commanders. But the most vivid source always remains Caesar himself, who indignantly recounts how his officers Quintus Tullius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculius Cotta, who fell victim to a false negotiation, led their troops on a disastrous march that ended with their extermination near Atuatuca. The episode had enormous resonance. A legion and a half, that is to say about 10,000 men, was annihilated in a few hours. For the Romans, accustomed to thinking of themselves as invincible against the barbarians, the news was a shock. For the Gallic populations, however, it was an encouraging sign. If the Eburones, small and not particularly powerful, had been capable of inflicting such a serious blow, then Roman domination could be undermined. The Treveri themselves and other Belgian tribes considered joining the insurrection. Caesar's immediate reaction was aimed at containing the danger of a domino effect. He could not afford to let news of the defeat cause a general uprising, and so he quickly organized a relief campaign. At that point another dramatic episode was already taking place. The siege of the camp of the legate Quintus Tullius Cicero, brother of the famous orator Marcus Tullius Cicero, who found himself isolated with his legion in hostile territory. This event, too, handed down with a wealth of detail in the Commentarii, shows how thin the boundary was between the stability and collapse of Roman rule in the region. The introduction of this study therefore intends to frame the Eburones revolt not as a marginal or episodic event, but as a decisive moment of the campaign in Gaul. For a few months, in fact, Roman power risked being overwhelmed not by large organized coalitions like that of the Helvetii or the Belgians, but by a skillfully conducted local insurrection. The story highlights the weak points of the Roman military apparatus, forced to depend on difficult communications, uncertain supplies, and local commanders who were not always able to maintain discipline and clarity in the most critical situations. At the same time, the revolt shows the resilience of the Roman system and above all the figure of Caesar as commander. It is he, with his decision and speed of movement, who prevents the defeat from turning into a strategic catastrophe. Caesar appears as the point of balance without which the dispersed legions would have risked annihilation. It is no coincidence that, even in the story of the Commentarii, Caesar's image is strengthened. Despite the loss of men and the logistical difficulties, he manages to present himself as the savior who arrives at the last minute to free his men and re-establish Roman supremacy. The story of Ambiorix and the Eburones, although it ended with the devastation of their territory and with the disappearance of the people from the historical scene, remained in Roman memory as an example of obstinate rebellion and deception suffered. It shows the other side of the coin of the conquest. Behind the glory of the victories and the rhetoric of universal domination, there were local resistances, coups, unexpected defeats. For this reason, the revolt of the Eburones constitutes a privileged observation point for understanding not only Caesar's campaign in Gaul, but more generally the structural difficulties of the Romanization process. The following text aims to analyze these events in an orderly manner, from the preparation of the revolt to the long-term consequences. It will do so by closely following the documents of the time, first and foremost the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, without forgetting the other ancient testimonies that allow us to compare and critically evaluate the Caesarian tale. The objective is to restore a realistic and rhetoric-free picture, which shows the Gallic War not only as an epic of conquest, but as a harsh and uncertain confrontation between different worlds, in which the courage of the local peoples and the ingenuity of their leaders could still endanger the most powerful military machine in the Mediterranean. After the first victorious campaigns, Caesar found himself needing to consolidate control of northern Gaul. The region that worried him most was what he himself, in his account, defines as Gallia Belgica, a territory populated by people who considered themselves different from both the Celts and the Aquitanians, and who prided themselves on being the furthest from the customs and influence of Mediterranean civilization. These peoples, among which the Nervians, the Treverii, the Atuatuci, and the Eburones stood out, were linked by linguistic affinities and common warrior traditions, but never constituted a stable political unit. Their strength lay in their ability to quickly mobilize youth for war and in their deep attachment to tribal freedom, while their weakness was internal fragmentation and the difficulty in sustaining long military campaigns against an organized adversary like Rome. The Eburones, protagonists of the revolt that would dramatically mark the campaign of 54 BC, occupied a territory between the lower course of the Meuse and the forests of the Ardennes, in a strategic border area, exposed on one side to the influence of the Germans beyond the Rhine and on the other to Roman pressure. Caesar describes them as not numerous but astute people, skilled in taking advantage of circumstances. Their leader was Ambiorix, who together with Catavalco, another elderly king of the tribe, represented the local political authority. His name, destined to remain in Latin memory as a symbol of deception and betrayal, appears for the first time in the Commentarii. The initial submission of the Eburones had not eliminated tensions. As frequently happened in conquered Gaul, the Romans imposed tributes, grain requisitions, and logistical difficulties increased discontent. Caesar's own commentaries report that, in the winter of 54, the scarcity of crops had made it necessary to distribute the legions more heavily in the winter quarters, imposing the burden of sustenance on the local communities. This meant, for the Gauls, having to provide not only food resources, but also accept the constant presence of Roman garrisons in their territories, a presence that effectively represented the loss of autonomy. The system of winter camps, a strategic choice that guaranteed Caesar control of the territory and the possibility of intervening quickly in multiple points, hit a weak point. The legions were dispersed and could be isolated. The Roman officers who had received responsibility for these garrisons were often linked to Caesar by relationships of personal trust, as in the case of Quintus Tullius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculius Cotta, who would become tragic protagonists of the subsequent defeat. In the context of the mid-1st century BC, the relationship between Rome and the Belgian peoples was therefore a precarious balance. The Belgians themselves, whom Caesar describes in the second book of his Commentarii as the most warlike in all of Gaul because they were further from Roman civilization and closer to the Germans, had never willingly accepted domination. Although the great coalitions had been broken, local leaders remained ready to take advantage of any favorable opportunity. Ambiorix, in particular, understood that the dispersion of the Roman forces in the winter of 54 constituted the most favorable opportunity to strike. An interesting aspect that emerges from Caesar's story is the diplomatic duplicity of the Gauls. Ambiorix, before openly rising up, maintained formal relations with the Romans for a long time, negotiating with them and welcoming impositions with apparent deference. Caesar himself recalls how he was skilled at feigning friendship and buying time, promising support but in reality preparing the insurrection. This political skill was not at all unusual in the Gallic world, where the leaders often found themselves caught between the need not to offend Rome and the need to maintain prestige among their communities, who could not stand the idea of submitting. Northern Gaul, unlike the already Romanized southern regions, was characterized by a predominantly agricultural economy and less centralized political structures. The Eburones did not possess large cities or complex institutions like those of some Celtic peoples further south. They lived dispersed in fortified villages and scattered settlements, protected by forests and marshy lands, conditions that would have made their territory particularly suitable for guerrilla warfare and ambushes. Caesar himself, who knew well the logistical difficulties of moving in such areas, did not hide his frustration at having to chase an enemy who was avoiding a head-on clash. What determined the outbreak of the revolt were not only economic reasons, but also questions of political prestige. The Belgian leaders were used to competing with each other for supremacy, and the charisma of a leader like Ambiorix could not be consolidated except through an act of collective courage, capable of demonstrating that the Romans were not invincible. In the tribal world, reputation was built on the battlefield, and the ability to lead a victorious coup represented the guarantee of loyalty on the part of the warriors. For this reason, Ambiorix presented himself to his people as the one who could take advantage of the circumstances to free the tribe from the Roman presence. Later historians, such as Cassius Dio, underlined the role of deception and cunning in Ambiorix's strategy. He did not attempt to confront the Romans in the open, but chose to strike them when they were most vulnerable, exploiting their confidence and causing them to move from a relatively safe position into a fatal march. Before achieving this, however, he had to convince his allies and build a support network among nearby populations. This alliance process relied less on written treaties, as was customary in Rome, and more on mutual oaths, banquets, and promises of spoils. The Commentarii do not hide the fact that Ambiorix's cunning managed to surprise the Roman commanders, who underestimated the extent of the threat. Sabinus and Cotta, destined to fall into the trap, were faced with difficult choices. The news spread by the Eburones spoke of an oncoming general insurrection, of an imminent attack by the Germans, and of the impossibility of resisting alone. Ambiorix himself, pretending to act as a friend, advised the Romans to abandon their camp to save themselves. It is evident that without careful diplomatic preparation and without a profound knowledge of Roman fears, this stratagem would not have been successful. The figure of Ambiorix, therefore, must be interpreted not only as that of a barbarian leader capable of a lucky shot, but as that of a leader who had understood the weak points of the Roman military apparatus and had exploited them. If the power of the legions was fearsome in direct conflict, their vulnerability emerged in the management of resources and the dispersion of garrisons. Caesar himself, in Book V of his commentary, implicitly recognizes that the decision to divide the troops into winter quarters had opened up the possibility of such risks, while justifying it with the need to deal with famine. The general context of Gaul at that time also made the situation more delicate. The Treveri, based along the Moselle, were also agitated, and their leader Induziamero was exploring the possibility of rebelling. The instability was therefore not confined to the Eburones, but spread throughout the region. Rome, although strong and organized, found itself in that historical phase having to govern a vast and still largely hostile territory, with difficult lines of communication and an army forced to support itself with what it could obtain locally. It is interesting to observe how subsequent Roman historiography, starting from authors of the imperial age, has tended to emphasize the cruelty of Caesar's retaliation rather than the initial success of Ambiorix. This derives from the fact that the episode, although representing a defeat for Rome, was later transformed into an example of the general's ability to respond decisively. However, if the sources are analyzed with a critical eye, it clearly emerges that in the second half of the 1st century BC Roman domination in Gaul was far from being secure and definitive. The first part of the story therefore serves to outline the framework within which the revolt took place. Gallia Belgica, characterized by independent and proud peoples, was the scene of a clash that put Roman strategy to the test. Ambiorix, despite belonging to a relatively small population, was able to interpret the general discontent and use it as a lever to trigger the rebellion. The subsequent events, marked by the defeat of Sabinus and Cotta and the siege of Quintus Cicero's camp, show how one of the most serious crises of Caesar's Gallic campaign was born from this local context. During the winter of 54 BC, the Roman legions were distributed in different quarters, each entrusted to a legate or lieutenant of Caesar. This choice, imposed by the circumstances of famine and supply difficulties, had made the garrisons vulnerable. One of these legions, reinforced by 5 cohorts, had been entrusted to Quintus Tullius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculius Cotta, experienced officers who had been tasked with guarding the Eburones area and ensuring order in an already restless region. Their presence represented a constant humiliation for the inhabitants and at the same time an economic burden, since it was up to the local communities to provide grain, fodder, and shelter. Caesar himself, in Book V of the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, admits that the scarcity of the harvests had worsened relations with the populations, forcing the legions to ask for more than was reasonable. Ambiorix, who knew the situation well and was waiting for the right moment, decided to act. Before moving on to the open attack, he tried to attack the Romans with surprise and deception. Ancient tradition describes him as a shrewd leader, capable of mixing persuasive words and rapid military actions. At first he attacked the Roman camp with improvised forces, not with the intention of destroying it, but of giving the impression of a spontaneous revolt. This attack, repelled with difficulty by the Romans, was intended to prepare the ground for a negotiation. The most dramatic part of the story, handed down directly by Caesar, concerns the meeting between Ambiorix and the Roman commanders. After the first clash, he showed up with a small escort in front of the camp, pretending to want a dialogue and declaring himself forced by his own people to participate in the revolt. According to what Caesar reports, Ambiorix uttered words that proved decisive. He said he was personally grateful to the Romans, that he had received favors from them, but that he was unable to oppose the collective will of his men, pushed by other Belgian peoples and by the imminent arrival of the Germans beyond the Rhine. In an apparently sincere tone, he advised Sabinus and Cotta to abandon the camp and reach a safer garrison, guaranteeing them free passage and even offering to protect the march. This scene, reported in the Commentarii, shows how the Eburones king understood Roman psychology. He played on the fear of a joint attack by the Germans and on the commander's awareness that remaining isolated could mean destruction. His proposal appeared rational: leave a vulnerable field and move towards larger legions, with the guarantee of an enemy who presented himself as a friend. The Roman officers found themselves divided. Cotta, more prudent and distrustful, argued that we should not give in to pressure and that it was safer to remain entrenched, waiting for reinforcements or a signal from Caesar. Sabinus, on the contrary, judged it too dangerous to remain still and insisted on the need to follow Ambiorix's advice. Caesar, who in his story tends to underline the faults of his subordinates to exonerate himself, attributes the decisive error to Sabinus. The debate between the two commanders lasted a long time and even divided the centurions. In the end, Sabino's position prevailed, perhaps because the fear of being besieged without hope was stronger than the confidence in the solidity of the camp. Thus, the Romans made the decision to abandon the camp. The next morning, in an atmosphere of anxiety and suspicion, the column set out. Caesar describes the scene with details that convey the gravity of the moment. The legionaries, weighed down by baggage, forced to drag the wagons, surrounded by a landscape that they knew was hostile, proceeded through woods and valleys, while the Gauls, who knew the terrain, followed them secretly. Ambiorix had prepared the ambush carefully. At a favorable point, between gorges and steep terrain, the Eburones forces and their allies fell on the Roman column. The attack was sudden and devastating. The front lines were immediately broken and the convoy disintegrated. The Romans, weighed down and taken by surprise, were unable to maintain battle order. According to Caesar's account, Sabinus lost control, unable to organize a coherent defense. Cotta, however, remained calm and attempted to order a circular resistance, trying to save what he could. The fight turned into carnage. The Eburones cavalry pressed on the flanks, while the infantry, stationed on the heights, hurled javelins and stones at the Romans trapped below. The legionaries, squeezed between wagons and baggage, fell on top of each other without being able to form the usual compact line. Roman discipline, which proved superior in open battle, was cancelled out by circumstances on that occasion. Caesar says that Sabinus, desperate, tried to negotiate once again with Ambiorix, begging to spare his life and that of his soldiers. But it was a final deception. The king pretended to want to listen to him, made him come closer and immediately ordered him to be killed. The resistance continued under the leadership of Cotta, who, seriously wounded, continued to fight until the end. The remaining legionaries, seeing that all hope was lost, allowed themselves to be killed in combat rather than fall prisoner. In the end, an entire legion and 5 cohorts were annihilated. Only a few survivors managed to escape and bring news of the disaster. The scene described by Caesar is that of total annihilation, which leaves little room for individual heroism, except in the figure of Cotta, praised for his steadfastness. This episode, known as the defeat of Atuatuca, represented one of the most serious moments of the Gallic campaign. A legion and a half, that is, almost 10,000 men, had been wiped out in a few hours. Rome had not suffered similar losses for some time. The memory of this catastrophe remained alive for a long time, so much so that later authors such as Frontinus, in his Stratagemata, cite Ambiorix's deception as an example of military cunning. Even Cassius Dio, in his Roman history, although writing later, reports with admiration the ability of the Gauls to exploit the terrain and the weakness of the divided Romans. The consequences were immediate. The news spread quickly among the Belgian tribes, fueling suspicions that Rome was not unbeatable. The annihilation of the Roman column constituted an invitation for neighboring peoples to rise up, or at least to evaluate the possibility of freeing themselves from the yoke. The domino effect feared by Caesar was becoming reality. For the Eburones themselves, the victory had enormous symbolic value. They, a people hitherto considered marginal, had demonstrated that they could inflict a lethal blow on one of the most powerful military machines in the Mediterranean. It is significant to observe how Caesar, despite being the main narrator of the events, could not hide the extent of the defeat. He is at pains to place blame on Sabinus' mistakes, his excessive gullibility, and his inability to maintain discipline, contrasting him with the more positive figure of Cotta. However attenuated, the disaster remains evident. The very fact that Caesar reported it in so many details shows that it could not have been kept silent. The news was already known in Rome, and omitting it would have damaged his credibility. The episode of Sabinus and Cotta allows us to glimpse the internal tensions within the Roman command. The officers, chosen from among Caesar's trusted men or appointed for previous merits, did not always show cohesion. The division of opinion between Sabinus and Cotta, which led to contradictory decisions, reflects the difficulty of maintaining unity of command in exceptional circumstances. It is likely that the choice to follow Ambiorix's advice did not arise only from fear, but also from a political calculation. No one wanted to take on the responsibility of remaining still and risking passive destruction. In this sense, the episode reveals how psychological pressure and the fear of betraying duty can lead to hasty decisions. After the annihilation, Ambiorix gained prestige. His figure became the symbol of a leader capable of subduing the Romans with cunning. For Latin authors, this represented both a warning and a warning. In the following centuries, his name would remain as that of an irreducible enemy who, although defeated in the following campaigns, had demonstrated that even small peoples could undermine Roman rule. The destruction of a legion and a half under the leadership of Quintus Tullius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculius Cotta, which occurred near Atuatuca in 54 BC, had an immediate effect that went far beyond the military loss. For the first time during the Gallic campaigns, the Romans suffered a total annihilation of this magnitude, and the news spread with surprising speed. In a world without rapid means of communication, rumors spread from village to village, fueled and amplified, and within weeks the story was known to most of the Belgian tribes. Ambiorix, who until recently was only the leader of a marginal people, became the symbol of possible resistance and living proof that Rome was not invulnerable. Caesar, in Book V of the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, recognizes that the defeat had a domino effect. He writes that almost all of Gaul became agitated, with the Treveri ready to move under the leadership of Ambiorix, the Nervii discussing allying themselves with the Eburones, and even more distant populations evaluating whether to break the agreements stipulated. The Romans, accustomed to presenting themselves as bearers of order and discipline, suddenly appeared vulnerable, and this encouraged rumors of insurrection. The geographical location of the defeat itself was significant. Atuatuca was located in a strategic point in the center of Gallia Belgica, and its fall or insecurity threatened to open gaps throughout the Roman garrison system. The loss of men was not only numerical, but also psychological. A Roman legion represented not only a military unit, but a symbol of the power of Rome, with its eagles, its banners, the discipline that distinguished it from tribal bands. Seeing all this swept away by a deception and an ambush was a blow to imperial prestige. The eagles that fell into enemy hands, or were destroyed in the field, had an enormous symbolic value, and their loss was transformed into a defeat that went beyond the military level. The reaction of the other tribes was not long in coming. The Treveri, one of the most powerful populations in the region, with numerous cavalry and an extended territory along the Moselle, saw the opportunity to raise their heads against the Romans. Induziamero, their leader, took the moment to highlight himself. According to Caesar, he actively sought allies among neighboring populations, and Ambiorix's success was the most convincing argument for him. It was no longer necessary to fear the might of the legions if even an entire legion had been annihilated. Other peoples, such as the Nervii, who had already fought hard against Caesar in the past, considered the possibility of returning to arms. Instability was growing, and the danger of a general uprising appeared real. In this climate, even the Gauls themselves, who until recently had declared themselves faithful to Rome, hesitated. Loyalty to the victor was a flexible principle in the tribal world. It was based more on fear and calculation than on permanent constraints. If Rome appeared weak, then the convenience lay in rebelling or maintaining an ambiguous attitude. Caesar himself underlines how in those days messengers ran from one people to another, transmitting the news of the defeat and inviting rebellion. The situation became even more critical when Ambiorix, galvanized by the success, decided to continue the action and not limit himself to the victory obtained. The Eburones, together with their allies, moved against the camp where the legion led by Quintus Tullius Cicero was stationed. This attempt to extend the revolt shows that the objective was not only defensive, but that the Gallic leaders aspired to use the opportunity to inflict successive blows and possibly expel the Romans from the region altogether. From the Roman point of view, the immediate consequences were chaotic. There were very few survivors of the ambush, and the loss of entire cohorts meant that there were not enough men to maintain the scattered garrisons. The other legates received piecemeal news, often through messengers who had risked their lives to pass between enemy lines. The information arrived incomplete and confusing, but it was clear that the situation was serious. Uncertainty grew, and local commanders had to decide whether to stand still and wait, or move and risk falling into another ambush. Caesar, who in the meantime was in another part of Gaul, received the news late. His own account reveals how difficult it was to coordinate dispersed armies in such a vast and hostile territory. The general could not rely on rapid communications, which meant that he often had to react to events that had already occurred, without being able to prevent them. It is in this context that the vulnerability of the Roman system emerges. The most immediate effect of the defeat was the collapse of the perception of Roman invincibility. Previously, after the defeat of the Nervii and the victories over the Helvetii, the fame of Caesar and his legions was such that many peoples had submitted without fighting. Now, however, the Gauls discovered that Roman power could be weakened. This knowledge was as dangerous as the loss of men. The war at that time was not fought only with weapons, but also with propaganda, prestige, and the impression of strength. Caesar knew well that if he did not intervene quickly, the whole of northern Gaul could rise up. Modern commentators point out that his ability to react was decisive in avoiding a collapse. But in the phase immediately following the disaster, the scene was dominated by the initiative of the Gauls. Ambiorix sent messages everywhere, calling for rebellion, while Induziamar prepared to raise his people. The same figure of Catavalco, the elderly co-king of the Eburones, was cited as a guarantor of the revolt, even if his direct participation appears more symbolic. Later sources, such as Cassius Dio, point out that Rome actually risked losing control of the region. It was no longer a single military episode, but a crisis that affected the entire system of Roman dominion in Gaul. The loss of confidence in the imperial power could translate into a widespread revolt and a long-lasting war, capable of absorbing energy that Caesar could not afford to waste, especially considering the political situation in Rome, where his enemies waited for any pretext to accuse him of failures. Another immediate effect was the need for the Romans to reconsider how they distributed the legions. The idea of dividing the contingents into small garrisons, which on paper seemed to guarantee greater control of the territory, turned out to be extremely risky. The defeat of Sabinus and Cotta was concrete proof that a skilled and determined enemy could exploit the dispersion of the troops to strike and destroy an isolated garrison before the others could intervene. This teaching marked the subsequent campaigns and became part of Roman strategic reflection. The Gauls, for their part, learned that the element of surprise and the use of terrain could reverse the balance of power. Ambiorix's tactics, based on deception, manipulated information, and the choice of a favorable place for the ambush, constituted a model for other rebellions. It is no coincidence that, in the following centuries, military authors such as Frontinus cited his stratagem as an example of war intelligence. The effects of the defeat were therefore multiple: military, psychological, political. The Romans lost men and prestige, the Gauls gained confidence and courage. But above all, the general perception of the conflict changed. On the one hand, Caesar found himself forced to demonstrate his readiness once again and intervene personally to save his men. On the other hand, the tribes of Gaul understood that the fight was not yet over and that resistance was not useless. The following events will demonstrate that Rome possessed sufficient resources and organizational capabilities to re-establish control, but in the phase immediately following the defeat, the balance of the conflict seemed to have tilted in favor of the rebels. And it was in that context that Quintus Tullius Cicero, with his legion, became the target of the new assault, a prelude to a siege that would represent a further test for Roman resistance. After the defeat of the troops led by Quintus Tullius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculius Cotta, the situation in Gaul became unstable and rapidly deteriorating. Ambiorix, encouraged by the success, did not intend to limit himself to the blow dealt to Atuatuca, but tried to exploit the favorable wave to extend the rebellion and consolidate his position. His goal was to strike the Romans again before Caesar could react and restore order among the legions. It was in this context that the decision was made to besiege the winter camp where Quintus Tullius Cicero's legion was stationed. In De Bello Gallico, Caesar describes the siege with particular attention, as if to underline both the gravity of the threat and the resistance capacity of his men, who survived in desperate conditions. Cicero's camp had been built according to typical Roman technique, with ditches, embankments, and palisades, but its position, although fortified, was exposed in hostile territory. Ambiorix and his allies, after having mobilized troops among the Eburones and having received reinforcements from other tribes such as the Nervii and the Atuatuci, suddenly appeared in front of the garrison. The besiegers were numerous, and their confidence increased by recent victories made the undertaking even more dangerous for the defenders. Caesar observes that the Gauls, stimulated by the Roman example, began to adopt warfare techniques that were not specific to their traditions, such as the use of mobile towers and improvised siege engines. It was no longer just a question of frontal attacks and ambushes, but of an organized attempt to conquer a Roman fortified camp, a rare and dangerous occurrence. The days of the siege were marked by continuous fighting. The besiegers tried new stratagems every day, building embankments to get closer to the walls, throwing darts and stones, trying to set fire to the fortifications with burning faggots. The Romans, for their part, responded with the discipline and ingenuity that distinguished them, strengthening the defenses, putting out the fires and counterattacking with targeted sorties. Caesar describes how the legionaries, although exhausted, did not stop working day and night, repairing the damage and maintaining high resistance. Quintus Cicero himself, according to the story, was at the forefront of his men, encouraging them and participating in the work, although suffering from a wound. This detail, which Caesar himself inserted with emphasis, had the clear intention of enhancing the honor of Marcus Tullius' brother Cicero, a well-known orator in Rome, and showing how Roman virtue was manifested both in men of culture and in soldiers. The siege was not only a test of material strength, but also a duel of deception and communications. Ambiorix tried several times to convince Cicero to negotiate, resorting to the same stratagems used against Sabinus and Cotta. He proposed that he leave the camp safely, arguing that the Gauls did not want war with Rome, but only to free themselves from the burden of requisitions. However, the memory of the defeat of Atuatuca made the Romans wary, and Cicero refused any negotiations. The memory of the Eburones perfidy was still too vivid, and the lesson learned at the cost of the blood of thousands of soldiers was not forgotten. Caesar himself underlines how the legate's prudence was the main reason why the legion was able to resist until his arrival. One of the most dramatic episodes of the siege was the attempt to send messengers to Caesar. The legionaries understood that without external help they would not be able to resist for long. Some volunteers were chosen who, during the night, tried to cross the enemy lines to bring the news to the general. Many of these attempts failed, with the messengers captured and killed by the besiegers. But in the end one of them managed to reach Caesarea and give him the information that would trigger the rescue march. The risk of these missions, carried out in hostile and guarded territory, demonstrates the extent to which the legion was isolated and how serious their condition was. The pressure from the besiegers was incessant. Caesar recounts that every day the Gauls tried to introduce new techniques, sometimes imitating the same Roman practices observed in previous battles. The construction of a tower as tall as the Roman fortifications is a significant detail. It demonstrates not only the ability to learn quickly, but also the desire to bring the siege to a level of intensity similar to that of the Mediterranean wars. For the Romans, seeing the Gauls using tools typical of their own war art must have been surprising and disturbing. However, the organizational skill of the legionaries managed to compensate for this sudden technological parity. The days passed and the losses among the Romans increased. Wounds, hunger, and lack of rest wore down the soldiers, and desperation began to make itself felt. Cesare writes that discipline prevented them from panicking, but he does not hide the fact that the situation was at its limit. Some modern scholars have observed that the Caesarian story, while wanting to glorify resistance, suggests how close the legion was to collapse. Without Caesar's timely arrival, Cicero and his men would probably have been annihilated as well, and Gaul would have seen a second disaster in a few weeks. Later sources, such as Cassius Dio and Appian, confirmed the impression that the siege was one of the most dangerous moments for Roman rule in Gaul. The fact that a single legate and a single legion could resist against such a numerous enemy was considered a heroic act. But beyond the rhetoric, the episode demonstrates how the Gauls had understood the vulnerability of the Roman system and had learned to exploit the war techniques of their own oppressors. The siege lasted several weeks, and the Romans did not give in. Every day was a fight for survival, every night a continuous work to repair the walls and keep hope alive. Quintus Cicero emerges as a central figure. Not a famous general, not a career leader, but a legate who knew how to embody resistance. His constancy and firmness were praised even by his adversaries, who recognized Roman obstinacy. Overall, the story shows a significant transformation of the conflict. It was no longer a matter of simple pitched battles, but of a war involving complex techniques, sieges, propaganda, and psychology. The siege of Cicero's camp was the test in which the Gauls showed their ability to adapt and the Romans their strength of resistance. The confrontation was not decided only by weapons, but by the ability to withstand the pressure of time, hunger, and fear. The Caesarian tale insists on the desperation of the legionaries and their willingness to resist anyway, a theme that is part of the broader Roman rhetoric of Virtus. But at the same time, behind the lines, we can sense the real concern of Caesar, who understood how the fate of a legion could decide the course of the entire campaign. Cicero's siege was not a marginal episode, but a critical moment that could have changed the outcome of the war in Gaul. When the news finally reached Caesar, he found himself faced with a difficult choice: risk leaving other areas uncovered to come to the rescue, or wait and risk losing an entire legion. The decision to march immediately towards Cicero, facing enormous logistical difficulties, was one of the moments that marked his military genius. But up to that point, the siege had demonstrated how the Romans could find themselves caught between survival and annihilation. News of Quintus Tullius Cicero's desperate situation reached Caesar when the crisis already seemed out of control. It was 54 BC, and the Roman general was several days on the march, busy managing other garrisons and preventing the risk of the insurrection spreading further. In the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, Caesar himself reports how he received a messenger who left the besieged camp at night, the only survivor of various attempts to break the encirclement. The news was clear: if he had not intervened quickly, that legion too would have been annihilated, repeating the tragedy of Sabinus and Cotta. The situation did not allow for hesitation. Caesar then gathered all the forces he could muster immediately, reduced to a few scattered cohorts, and decided to undertake a forced march. His goal was to surprise the besiegers before Cicero's legion surrendered. Modern scholars, such as K. Welch and C. Meyer, have observed that the episode demonstrates Caesar's ability to react promptly in emergency situations. The speed with which he managed to move troops across difficult terrain, in the heart of the Gallic winter, is an aspect that underlines the efficiency of the Roman military machine. Caesar marched with a limited number of men, no more than 2 legions collected from various garrisons, and ordered the soldiers to travel with light equipment, giving up baggage and backpacks to save time. The Commentarii highlight the importance of speed. Every day was a fight against time, and the enemy had the advantage of already being deployed and having the initiative. During the march, Caesar not only moved quickly, but also resorted to stratagems to confuse the enemy. He knew well that Ambiorix and his allies had scouts and cavalry ready to monitor the Roman movements. For this reason, he made people believe he had more strength than he actually had, lighting fires and making noise at night to simulate a larger army. This stratagem, remembered by Caesar himself, had the effect of discouraging the enemies, who feared facing a larger contingent. Meanwhile, Cicero's camp was now exhausted. The legionaries were reduced by hunger and tiredness, many wounded could no longer fight, and the besiegers had almost completed the assault structures. According to Caesar's account, The Eburones and their allies had raised siege towers and pushed ramps up to the moat, a sign that the final assault was imminent. Caesare's arrival was therefore not just an act of relief, but arrived exactly at the limit of the time allowed by the resistance of the defenders. This detail, which the general himself underlines, increases the epic nature of his intervention, but is not without historical foundation. The correspondence with the timing of the sieges known in the ancient world shows how much the Romans risked losing that garrison too. Caesar, with his small army, could not afford a pitched battle against a numerous and freshly won enemy. Therefore he resorted to another stratagem. He camped a short distance from the besieged camp and built a clearly visible fortified camp, but deliberately placed in an apparently vulnerable position. In this way he challenged Ambiorix to a direct attack, giving the impression of being weak. The deception worked. The besiegers, convinced that they could destroy Caesar as they had done with Sabinus and Cotta, launched the assault. But this time the discipline and organization of the legions prevailed. Caesar had chosen the terrain carefully, prepared traps and ordered his men not to give in to the initial impetus. When the Gauls attacked en masse, they were repelled with heavy losses. The next day, Caesar decided to attack to break the siege. His army, although numerically inferior, advanced in close formation, aiming for a swift and decisive blow. The besiegers, surprised by the resistance of the previous day and fearful that other legions would arrive, began to give in. Ambiorix himself, realizing the risk, was among the first to flee. His charisma was not enough to maintain cohesion, and the Roman camp was liberated. Cicero's legionaries, exhausted but still alive, were thus able to join the reinforcements and escape certain destruction. The Caesarian story, as always, tends to exalt the role of the general. It is likely that the number of besiegers had been inflated to make the victory more impressive. However, even taking into account the propaganda, there is no doubt that the liberation of the camp was a decisive moment. If Caesar had not arrived in time, the loss of another legion would have made it impossible to contain the revolt, and the whole of Gaul might have risen. Cassius Dio, centuries later, would confirm that the readiness of the Roman general was what saved the situation. The liberation of the camp had an immediate impact on morale. Cicero's legionaries, although exhausted, represented an example of resistance, while Caesar's troops gained confidence in their commander. The news spread quickly among the Gauls, and although it was not enough to completely extinguish the rebellion, it cooled the enthusiasm of many tribes who had hesitated on the point of joining Ambiorix. Induziamarus of the Treveri continued to foment the revolt, but the defeats suffered by the besiegers convinced several peoples to maintain a certain prudence. Another important element is the symbolic value of Cicero's salvation. Marcus Tullius Cicero was the most famous voice of eloquence in Rome, and the fact that his brother had been saved at the last minute added political and propagandistic significance to the undertaking. Caesar could present himself not only as defender of the legions, but also as savior of the family of one of the most eminent men in the city. This strengthened his political position at a time when the conflict with his internal opponents, such as Cato and supporters of the traditional Senate, was becoming increasingly bitter. Scholars note that Caesar's march and the liberation of Cicero's camp reveal a characteristic trait of his leadership: the ability to transform a desperate situation into an opportunity for glory. In the narrative of the Commentarii, the general always appears at the center, endowed with a superior lucidity that allows him to see what others do not see. Regardless of the rhetoric, the fact remains that his quick decision and his use of military stratagems averted a disaster. The episode also shows a broader aspect of the war in Gaul. The confrontation was not only between Rome and the local tribes, but between two models of combat. On the one hand, the organization, discipline, and systematic use of the stratagems typical of the Roman military tradition. On the other, the impetus, mobility, and adaptability of the Gauls. In this case Rome prevailed, but the balance was fragile and demonstrated that there was no absolute superiority. After the liberation, Caesar moved to consolidate the position. He collected the wounded, ordered the camp to be further strengthened, and regained control of the area. The siege had been a serious blow to the confidence of the Gauls, but it was not enough to end the revolt. Ambiorix had managed to escape and remained free to foment further insurrections. However, the immediate danger was averted, and Rome could boast a victory that partially offset the catastrophe of Atuatuca. Subsequent sources have handed down this episode as one of the most famous examples of resistance and military readiness. Frontinus, in the Stratagemata, We'll cite Caesar's choice to simulate weakness to attract the opponent as one of the examples of tactical genius. This shows how much the episode remained in the Roman military memory as a case to be studied. Ultimately, Caesar's march and the liberation of Quintus Tullius Cicero's camp represented a crucial moment in the Gallic campaign. They did not erase the trauma of the defeat suffered by Sabinus and Cotta, but they prevented the revolt from assuming uncontrollable proportions. Caesar was able to transform an imminent threat into an opportunity for consolidation, maintaining firm control of his legions and sending a clear message to the Gallic tribes: Rome was still capable of reacting and inflicting decisive blows. After the liberation of Quintus Tullius Cicero's camp, the revolt of the Eburones was not over, but the initiative had once again passed into the hands of the Romans. Caesar understood that he could not leave the defeat of Atuatuca and the threat posed by Ambiorix unpunished, otherwise the whole of northern Gaul would risk falling into mass rebellion. In the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, in Book V, the general describes in detail his decision to go on the counterattack, devastating the territories of the Eburones. The objective was not only punitive, but also symbolic. It was necessary to erase the perception that the Gauls could inflict serious blows without suffering consequences. For the Romans, the concept of deterrence translated into annihilation operations, aimed at making an example of anyone who dared to rebel. Caesar therefore ordered the legions to travel through the territory of the Eburones, destroying fields, burning villages and capturing prisoners, transforming the region into a desolate land. The role of Ambiorix in this phase was still central, but his figure became more elusive. Cesare himself says he chased him for a long time without ever managing to capture him. Ambiorix, unlike other tribal leaders who had chosen to face the Romans in the open field, preferred to adopt the strategy of escape and guerrilla warfare. He moved quickly through forests and swamps, using his knowledge of the terrain and the support of his men. His ability to constantly evade the enemy increased his fame among the Gauls and made him almost a legendary symbol of resistance, but at the same time deprived the revolt of a stable command. Caesar himself admits that he could never have the direct confrontation he desired, and this contributed to the image of Ambiorix as a cunning and elusive leader. Another figure that emerges in this phase is Induziamero, leader of the Treveri, who continued to foment the revolt. He gathered his cavalry and tried to raise the nearby populations, but was defeated and killed in a clash with the legions. His death marked an important moment, as it deprived the rebellion of an influential leader and made many tribes realize the high cost of open resistance against Rome. Caesar underlines how Induziamero's head was brought to the Roman camp, a gesture that had a precise political meaning, to show the fate reserved for those who challenged imperial power. The retaliation against the Eburones was very harsh and affected not only the fighters, but the entire population. Modern historians speak of a real campaign of extermination, conducted systematically. Caesar did not limit himself to using his own legions, but also invited the neighboring peoples to join in the devastation, authorizing them to raid the territories and take possession of loot and prisoners. In this way he transformed the punishment of the Eburones into an opportunity for enrichment for the allied tribes, strengthening his control and further dividing the Gauls. The choice to involve other peoples in the destruction demonstrates his political skill. He did not act only with force, but also with calculation, offering immediate advantages to those who chose to remain faithful. However, Roman revenge did not erase the image of Ambiorix. On the contrary, his ability to escape the enemy and the legend of his rebellion continued to circulate. Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century, still cites him as an example of a leader who knew how to put Rome into crisis, and Tacitus himself, speaking of the Germans, mentions the memory of peoples capable of opposing the empire. Frontinus, in the Stratagemata, recalled the stratagem used by Ambiorix against Sabinus and Cotta as a lesson in military deception to be passed down. This shows that, despite being defeated on the material level, the Eburon leader won on the level of memory, becoming a model of astute resistance. The consequences of the revolt were not only local. The crisis highlighted the fragility of the Roman presence in Gaul. If 2 legions could be destroyed or nearly annihilated in a few weeks, it meant that Rome's rule was not yet consolidated. Caesar had to reorganize the garrison system, avoiding excessively dividing the legions and adopting a strategy of concentrating forces. The lesson of Atuatuca and the siege of Cicero's camp led to a change in the way of occupying the region. Fewer isolated garrisons, more large armies capable of moving quickly. This adaptation was part of the typical flexibility of the Roman machine, but it demonstrates that even an expert commander like Caesar could make strategic evaluation errors. From a political point of view, The Eburones revolt was exploited by Caesar himself to strengthen his image in Rome. In the Commentarii, he transformed a disaster into a tale of virtue and readiness. Cicero's heroic resistance, the speed of his march, the cunning in simulating weakness, the severity of the retaliation, everything contributed to building the image of a commander who did not let himself be defeated by difficulties. The defeat of Sabinus and Cotta, although a catastrophe, was relegated to a negative episode, balanced by the narrative of liberation and revenge. In this way, Caesar presented himself not as a fallible general, but as a leader capable of dominating even the most serious crises. The echo of the revolt also spread beyond Gaul. The Germanic peoples, observing the difficulty of the Romans, were encouraged to maintain their independence, and the Gallic populations did not forget the figure of Ambiorix. The idea that Rome could be hit, deceived and forced onto the defensive long survived, and although Caesar's subsequent campaigns consolidated Roman rule, resistance was never completely quelled. Vercingetorix's own revolt in 52 BC fits into this context of renewed confidence in the possibility of opposition. Some scholars see in Ambiorix's victory a psychological precedent that made the broad coalition led by Vercingetorix possible 2 years later. In terms of historical memory, the story of the Eburones is paradoxical. Their people, as a political entity, were practically obliterated by the Roman retaliation, to the point that later authors mention them only as an example of destruction. But the name of their leader survived over the centuries, and Ambiorix became a national hero in Belgium in the modern age, with statues and monuments dedicated to him. This shows how the history written by the victors, despite having reduced the rebellion to an episode from a military manual, did not manage to completely erase its symbolic value. On a strictly military level, the revolt revealed that Rome's strength did not lie only in the legions, but above all in the resilience of the system. A single disaster could jeopardize control, but Caesar's ability to react quickly, scapegoat the enemy, and rebuild order demonstrated that the empire had the tools to absorb blows. What the Gauls interpreted as a strategic victory turned out, in the long term, only to be a delay in the Roman advance. However, the ferocity of the repression also shows the real fear that the insurrection had aroused. Contemporary historians have long debated the significance of the revolt. Some, like Christian Gaudino, underline the psychological aspect, the end of the myth of Roman invincibility. Others, like Adrian Goldsworthy, insist instead on the fact that the Roman military machine was able to react with such promptness as to transform the defeat into a moral victory. In any case, the revolt of the Eburones marked an important caesura in the Gallic campaign. From that moment Caesar could no longer consider Gaul subjugated, but had to treat it as a territory to be continually conquered. At the end of the campaign, the balance sheet was complex. Rome had lost thousands of men, an entire legion had been annihilated, and Roman prestige had faltered. But the rapid response and punishment inflicted on the Eburones had restored order and strengthened Caesar's image as a leader. Ambiorix, having survived the Roman hunt, remained a fugitive, while his people were obliterated. The Treveri, deprived of Induziamero, returned to submission. Gaul, although still restless, was brought back under Roman control. In conclusion, the revolt of the Eburones led by Ambiorix represents one of the most critical moments of Caesar's campaign in Gaul, an episode in which the power of Rome was seriously questioned and in which the adaptability of the local people emerged forcefully. The defeat of Sabinus and Cotta demonstrated that the empire was not invulnerable. Cicero's siege showed the heroism of the legionaries and the cunning of the Gauls. Caesar's march and the liberation of the camp revealed the readiness of the general, and the final reprisal highlighted the brutality of the Roman machine. Ambiorix, although defeated, became a symbol of resistance, and his memory has survived the centuries. Caesar, despite having suffered the hardest blow of his Gallic career, emerged strengthened on a political and personal level, consolidating the image of an infallible commander that he would carry with him to the end. The revolt of the Eburones thus remains an emblematic example of the conflict between imperial power and the freedom of the people, a story in which the Roman victory was accompanied by the birth of a myth that survived well beyond the destruction of a people.